Being a creative is a journey. You're constantly evolving. However you can stay inspired and resist burnout and be a part of an organization that helps you and supports you, just kind of trying to be grateful and trying to thrive is really, really important in meaningful work.
Strong companies, lasting partnerships, powerful events. Welcome to the Experience Builders Podcast.
Chris, we're having an episode on creativity. I thought I got the memo, but I obviously did not. For listeners or viewers on
You're
YouTube,
underprepared,
they
buddy.
will definitely, I am underprepared. They will definitely see what's wrong with my outfit today. Tell me about the get up. Tell me about you even posted about this on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, I'm really excited about today's Experience Builders episode. You and I have talked about this subject. Sachel and I have talked about this months ago. I was like, I got to have you on. This, the subject of creativity, it's such a, it's a main artery in our industry. And, I think a lot of people think about from a design standpoint, it's if you're, it's critical thinking. It's being creative in project management. If you're a business owner, it's everywhere. And I can't think of a sharper mind than Sachel's to really kick off a conversation about this. So like I said, you and I have talked about Khalil. This was on our list originally of the top 20 episodes we wanted to create. So when we finally were able to nail down a date and get Sachel Josefson on board with us, I've been preparing for a week for this, and I'm like, all right, I gotta bring my A game. I gotta channel, that Sachel Josephson energy. So I just thought, well, what would Sachel wear on any given Tuesday? Right. And so this, so a Michael Kors tuxedo blazer is just one of his, throws that on like you and I might throw on an Adidas t-shirt. So every time I see him, he's the sharpest guy in the room. So, and I don't know, I think, yes, it's part of his persona, but I think it makes a statement about the way his brain and his mind work, and super happy to be able to borrow that for an hour this morning.
Yeah. Welcome to the show, Sachel.
Awesome. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
Chris,
how did you
glasses look great.
How did the outfit come about? When did you start dressing like this? Has this always been a thing?
Oh, I think that there became a point in my life where, the subject is about creativity today. And there's an important component of creativity that is this notion of like self-doubt. And, I think it's very human to have self-doubt. And when there's another side to it, is if you just kind of let go of some of that self-doubt, I don't know that I fully have given it up. And it's something that I'm continually kind of trying to find the courage to be fearless. But when I kind of there became a point in my life where I was just like, I'm going to just try to be my authentic self. I grew up kind of being a jock and playing hockey and baseball. And a lot of my identity was channeled around sports. And then that kind of all ended. And I said, well, what does the next chapter look like for me? And, kind of going from high school to college is like a vulnerable state. And I kind of got to reimagine myself. And I really was passionate about architecture and graphic design and interior design. And I loved cars. And all of this just kind of manifested in me kind of rebuilding myself. And because we're always evolving as individuals. And so I kind of started seeing people and I was like, I kind of like that person's vibe. And when I think about being a professor, I've had wonderful professors, and I wouldn't be where I am without the wonderful mentors that have helped me along the way. But when I'm in the classroom, I'm always trying to be the professor I wish I had. And it's just a way for me to establish a vision for myself, so to speak. I've had wonderful parents, but I have 4 children, and I'm always trying to be the dad I wish I had, even though I have a great dad. You know what I mean? And so I'm saying, well, what does that look like? And it's, trying to create kids that are respectful, responsible, grateful, they participate in the world, and they too have the courage to follow their dreams. But it's important for me to practice that. And so I started dressing fun and just trying to take pride in things, and maybe partially the way I look, but it's also a manifestation of what's going on in my mind, because I love I love creativity, and I love design, and I love art, and why not wear it on the outside too?
Satchel, my mother made all the Griffin boys take Latin in high school, and I took Latin for 2 years.
Yeah.
And the very first phrase I ever learned in Latin, and it's probably one of the only 2 phrases I still remember, was vestis virum reddit, which is clothes make the man. And to your point, I think everybody can relate to the fact that if you look good, if you look in the mirror and you look good, you feel good. And to your point, I love what you were saying about it's a confidence thing. It's a self-esteem thing. And I'm a parent too. And you want to teach your kids to be their authentic selves in a world that is constantly trying to shape and channel them into a box or a label of some kind or another. And it takes a very confident individual to, in the middle of all that noise and influence, just be yourself. So love that. Love this conversation.
I also think it's so interesting that from you mentioned that you had been a jock, and there's this stigma around even vulnerability as being a jock, because you've got to maintain a certain persona and carry yourself in a certain light. And honestly, it's not that different in terms of the business world. Chris, I'm sure that you're familiar with it, but showing up to a networking event, you've got to talk the talk and walk the walk. And, you don't wear your emotions on your sleeve and different things like that. But as we talk about creativity and even just the vulnerability that you mentioned, Satchel, as you went through a transition and finding yourself, do you think that you're really able to find your creativity and, like you mentioned, Chris, your authentic self without being vulnerable?
Well, that's one of the things that when we talk about creativity as a discipline, we have the creative, that's the individual, and that person is constantly putting themselves out there for judgment. And part of being a designer is being vulnerable. And I don't like to necessarily, when you look at somebody, or you look at me, for example, or you see somebody with purple hair and you go, oh, you must be creative. And I don't necessarily want to associate creativity as a discipline with people's identity, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that you can dress like this and be creative, but you can also dress like this conceptually and not participate in the process of creativity, and or be a maker and be a part of producing the end product, which is also a manifestation of creativity. And so I almost think of it as 3 parts. There's the individual, and Khalil, your question about vulnerability and being a creative is that notion of self-doubt, and having the courage to persevere is so important, because you need to understand that what you're producing in the exhibit and event world is, we're really creating a conversation starter. When we design something, we're often designing it with the client, and if we're trying to co-create. And so there's a little bit of vulnerability there too, because you may think that the client is maybe on the wrong path, or they're providing suggestions that you're maybe not aligning with. And you have to find a way to almost pick your battles, and making sure that we're moving the project forward, and we're also being good listeners, and we're also being able to use the elements of art and principles of design to make sure that we're creating a really, really great experience. And when we are experience builders, there's just so many things to think about. There's the client, and then there's the design team, and then there's maybe a company like Chris's Crew XP that is actually producing it.
We're
And then
fulfillment, right? We're not.
yeah,
We don't drive
fulfilling.
strategic and creative, but you're right. We're the fulfillment team that people turn to.
And we're all doing this work so that when we build this machine, somebody can go into the machine, some transformation is occurring, and then they leave constructing meaning that they didn't have before.
You know,
And,
Khalil, let me jump in. I love this. By the way, so when I'm being creative, these are going to be my creative glasses, and then because I'm of that age, this is me having to look at the notes in this discussion that we've been planning for. I'm a huge fan. Sachel, I don't know if you were familiar with Sir Ken Robinson, which was he passed away in 2020, but he was just an unbelievable. I guess he was known as really an international advisor on the subject of education in the arts. And what you were saying earlier about being vulnerable, one of the things I know he always talked about was the thing about creativity. People that are, it's willing to be wrong. Right. It's putting yourself, and that's where the vulnerability, I think, comes from, right? You're putting, somebody once told me that design is problem solving. And there, if somebody's coming to you and says, "Hey, Sachel, I want you and your team to design me this great, work environment, office environment, or whatever it is." And there's a lot of ways they give you all the functional needs, but there's a lot of ways you can solve that problem with, creatively. So, and again, I've always wondered, and one of my questions is, if they reject that, they're not rejecting you, even though you put so much of yourself into it. And I think creative people mostly, really do that. But I'm rejecting solving the problem that way. And how do you not take that personally, right? When you put so much into that. By the way, is that something you ever you teach or talk about with your students?
Yeah, Ken Robinson is great. He wrote a book called The Element, and he talks about, his notion of creativity is being in the element. And Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi wrote a book called Flow, and there's lots of different ways of understanding. Rick Rubin just wrote a book about creativity as well, and he kind of thinks of it as a way of being. And Robinson kind of talks about like it's a state. And the challenge is that and to Ken Robinson's ideas, he really focuses on this educational idea, and the K-12 system is focused on getting the right answer. And the first thing that I do with my students is I'm like, okay, in this class, we're going to learn how to fail. We're going to fail early and we're going to fail often. And the students are like, what? And that's because we need to embrace this idea of creativity as a process where we're first kind of defining the problem, we're collecting information, we're using divergent thinking processes and brainstorming and understanding and analyzing, and then we're going to ultimately come up with a solution. And when we come up with a solution, we're being vulnerable, we share that solution, we develop feedback. And so your client may say, I like this, but this is way off and this is way off. And then we kind of create a revision, and then we redefine the problem, we recollect information. And it's important to understand that being creative is not linear, it's rather cyclical. And every time we go around this process, we're hoping to get closer and closer to the bullseye, so to speak. And
so is it fair to say very rarely do you hit the bullseye on the first attempt?
Yeah, and I think it's possible, but we need to create a culture in our organizations so that we don't have to hit the bullseye every time. When we, as makers or designers or artists, we are constantly planting seeds in a garden, and in order for not every seed is going to take, so the bullseye is, we got a project, the seed grew, it's beautiful. whatever, but we don't usually plant one seed, we plant multiple seeds, and we need to cultivate that garden so that as projects come, we can slowly pick beautiful roses, and we learn more about our garden as we continue to plant and cultivate. And so organizations need to create a culture of failure, and oftentimes the timelines don't allow. Timelines keep getting tighter and tighter and tighter. Post COVID, they're tighter, and and so that means that when the project comes across the designer's table, they have to get closer and closer to the bullseye, because there's not that much room for error, because they're also working on other projects that have tight deadlines.
Right.
And so we were, in some previous episodes, we were talking about like the death spiral or something along those lines.
Right.
And
favorite subject.
And the death spiral that happens within organizations happens inside the design department too. And when the design department is going through a death spiral, we need to try to create space for them to fail, but also to continue to be inspired.
What does that death spiral look like?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and is it a culture thing? Is it a behavior thing? It's what
is it project based? How does the death spiral start?
So I think that, if you get a project where it was supposed to be done yesterday, they have no money, and they have no idea what they want, And
you're talking to some of my old clients, is what you're
yeah, we're talking about the same thing.
We used to be a magnet for that type of partner.
And part of leadership's responsibility is vetting clients to make sure, you're going to get leads, but the qualifying of that lead and leadership's ability to protect their staff is vitally important. And to keep the culture of your organization alive. And if you have your employees back, they will reciprocate. And one of the things that the Experience Builders podcast talks about is building experiences for the event industry. And oftentimes as designers and makers, we're thinking about working within an organization. A client comes through the door and we're trying to design an experience for them. What needs to be happening, and Chris, you've alluded to this in previous episodes, is that you as a leader of your organization are creating an experience for not only your customers, but you're also creating an experience for your employees.
Yes.
And so how can we intentionally do that? And what systems can we put in place so that it's not just like, well, I hope this is working. And it needs to be like, really like, what are some things or systems that we can put in to think about the experience of an organization? The organization I work within at Bemidji State University, administration needs to be thinking about the faculty experience, but the faculty need to be thinking about the student experience. And every decision we make as professors needs to be focused on challenging and supporting students to help them follow their dreams. It's not to put them through our filters and say, this is what you're going to be at the end of this. It's us creating an experience that helps them self-actualize and ultimately really reach their dreams.
And so one of the things, Sachel, so he's talking about it from an educational standpoint, and he likes to quote Pablo Picasso. He said, all children are artists when they're born. The problem is them remaining that as they go through life in a world that seems to want to teach, train, and coach you out of that. And he talks a lot about how academic institutions really are designed to drive you to academic linear thinking, which doesn't leave room for, the band people and the theater people and the dance people. That gets pushed down to the bottom of the pyramid on academics. By the way, and then he talks about how the business world has then picked up on also sort of punishing, either by design or by default, wrongness, mistakes. You're not promoted. You're not kept as an employee. So you become afraid to fail or to not do it a certain way. And we really are losing the huge opportunity of unleashing that true, authentic power of anybody that's creative. And it could be my master carpenter in the shop who makes the sexiest reception counters you've ever seen, or it could be that original designer where you see a structure and environment and you go, this looks better than anything I even imagined. How did you come up with this? So how do we create culture in our workplace? Maybe even with people that have been in the workforce for 10 or 20 years and have been conditioned to not take those risks. How do we, is it possible to still bring that up? I mean, you're the farmer in the apple orchard growing the trees before they're picked and shipped, right? So that's a different set of challenges. But how about that fruit that's already been at their desk working away for so long, and they forgot what the smell of fresh cut grass and a sunny morning looks and feels like?
Yeah, you've talked a lot in previous episodes. You've talked about this like hybrid employee, and
I'm going to put these back on because I'm feeling creative right now.
how you can wear multiple hats. And if you think about an organization and you think about the culture that you're creating as it relates to this notion of oppression, it's a really interesting kind of thought exercise. If we think about oppression as a system, and so the leader of the organization is taking in every client that comes in, they don't care, it's all about revenue, and then he's pushing that work onto account managers and salespeople, and now they feel oppressed. And so to continue the system, in order for them to make you happy as the leader, then now they need to go to the design department and say, I need you to do something. I need you to work on Saturday and Sunday. Probably going to be long days. Oh, it's your kid's birthday party. Could you do this one for me? It'll just be this one time. And now the designer is being oppressed, and now they're mad. And the reason they're being oppressed is because of the person kind of shepherding the project, which was ultimately given to them by leadership. And now their kids are being oppressed and their family life is being oppressed. And
oh, by the way, are they doing their best work when they're feeling that way, Sachel?
Yeah. You talk about this notion of that I never thought about this until you brought it up in the podcast, is when we pay double time, we're getting the worst work. And I know it's not complicated to think about, but like we always think about the work being almost linear forever, but it doesn't. People,
sometimes you need something like sleep, right? Sometimes you just need to get up and change your physical location to get a fresh perspective, right?
Yeah, effective. So what you're talking about with the shop is happening to the designer. So the designer's process is now oppressing the shop. And now you have a system of oppression. And so we say, well, what does the other side of this look like? And how much does it cost? And it's basically, how do we create a system of freedom? And so we manage the clients that come through the door. And every once in a while, we'll get that project that comes through the door where they have a budget, they have no time, and it's a potential client that could move our organization forward. But when times like that happen, we bring everybody together and we say, here's the deal. We got this customer that came through the door. They have money. They have no time. They want it basically yesterday. What should we do? And you may, when you create a system of freedom, get them to say, it's my kid's birthday party this week. I need to be out of here by 5 p.m. and I'll come back at 10 p.m. But I will rock this because I want this business for our organization and the shop, and everybody rallies around it. And now you have a system of freedom where everybody's bought into the culture of the organization and they don't feel resentful, but rather they feel empowered. And so
that spirit of inclusion and sort of a permission-based approach, not a dictator approach.
Totally.
And by the way, if that's a culture they feel part of and are proud to be part of that, they want to. You're right. I'm willing to sacrifice something here for the good of the team because I get what we are all building and working towards. And so, which by the way, if you're a business owner or a business leader listening to this, that should absolutely be recognized in front of the tribe at that right moment. It don't let that person, do those things repeatedly without taking a minute, on your Thursday pub crawl after, or your Monday lunch bunch, raise a glass and say, let's give it up for Marianne, who just absolutely slayed it by putting this, and this on hold. We got a deal, and she's the reason because of the extra
Totally.
effort. Because you can't underestimate that type of recognition when I catch you doing something right and selfless, right?
Moments of recognition are extremely important in all of this. And, one of the things to also think about that I've been kind of exploring is this notion of customer burnout. And so we're oftentimes worried about our own organization and making sure that we are creating a good culture and empowering our employees. And then within the design department, how do we make sure that we are creating a culture of freedom and empowering our designers not to feel burnt out? But another thing to think about is when we think about our customers, how can we make sure that our processes and the processes of the industry, some of them we have control over, some of them we don't have control over, how do we try to mitigate and control the burnout for our customers? An analogy to this is in the healthcare field. There's a lot of provider burnout, but there's also a lot of patient burnout. Patients call the hospital, they can't get in, their leg hurts, they have to wait a few weeks, then they finally get in, then they get referred to the next person, and then that's a few weeks out, and then the provider calls in, and then that pushes them out a few more weeks, and then the medication they get isn't working, so they have to get another appointment, and then before you know it, the patient has decided, you know what, it's actually easier just to deal with the pain rather than to deal with this system that I'm a part of. And so if we think about the event industry and we think about that client that comes through the door that needs something last second, how can we create such a good experience that actually our employees feel empowered, but actually our customers also feel empowered, so that the easiest customer to get is the one you already have. And if you can alleviate their burnout, they're going to stick with you for life.
Do you talk about this in class, Sachel?
Oh, we talk. Well, which parts?
The
organization.
I'm first of all, I'm blown away to sit and think that there's a group of incoming designers that are sitting there thinking about customer burnout, not their own burnout, but because if you talk about a serve you mindset, right? If you're recognized, because this is it's funny. I read a study that said an event manager is the fifth most stressful job in the United States. It's right behind police officer, which is number 4. So an event manager is right behind the people that get shot at, right? And you go, now that's stressful. So for an incoming designer to be thinking about, to have the empathy about what they're going through and the stress of that job, and they're very, for a lot of reasons, right? They may be on the edge of burnout with, we know how frustrated they are with the lack of transparency on costs. I had this conversation with the exhibitor advocate, some of the board members, and they said, I'm a master's degree in marketing person, and yet I am constantly 50% over budget at the end of my show and event. And I look like an idiot to my vice president boss that I report to. And it's not that I'm not managing to a budget. It's that there's all these hidden costs that keep showing up. And talk about an anxiety, and they live in fear of will my job be limited? Will they get somebody else because they just don't like the bad news? And I'm working like hell to try and manage these, but when there's 29 different ways to calculate material handling fees, I can't estimate what that, right? So, but again, all the way through the beginning of the process, for a designer to just be empathetic to a customer that lives with that level of stress is just amazing to me.
I think our industry depends upon our customers not being burnt out. When we think about, which we are so focused on our own organizations, but when we think about the industry from a more macro level, we didn't know what was going to happen after COVID. We weren't sure what was going to happen, and we didn't know if everybody was going to be living their lives with a headset in the metaverse, or what. And one of the awesome things that I'm so grateful for is we almost have a renaissance in togetherness, and the event industry is thriving as it should. But in order to continue its success and actually take it to another level, we have to be mindful of all the participants and all the stakeholders involved. And if going to an event is so much work that the organization is losing its employees because they're burnt out, then they're not going to be knocking on our doors to do the project. And they're not going to be knocking on your door. And again, we're creating a system of oppression in that manner that is at a more macro level.
Khalil, you're listening to two high-achieving event professionals just, pickleball these topics back and forth. By the way, I just invented that as a verb now, pickleballing. See how I did that? I weaved in a nice,
you're so creative, Chris.
Current event. Well, you know what? Let me get these back on. But as a business guy listening in, what are sort of the halftime takeaways you're picking up on right now? What's sticking as maybe you weren't thinking about
so
this
much.
or it's relevant? Yeah.
I think it's so helpful to see from Sachel's perspective. We talk a lot about the business side of things on this show, Chris, and to hear from the designer's perspective, how the business impacts their process and even the way that they feel is really a tremendous perspective to see as a leader. But then also to see that it's helpful for the designers to understand the high level aspect of why we're taking on this client and maybe even pushing through a project that doesn't necessarily make sense to our current status as a company as far as our capacity, but it does make sense to our future. And we're bought in if we understand the vision, then I think that's huge. And then also understanding the customer's perspective, I think that's great. But even as you guys are talking about how the industry is having a renaissance and a coming together, it's often through the dark moments that you find inspiration and that you find a way forward that's more collective, that's more powerful than ever. And I think that's a really cool thing to see that you guys are seeing in the industry and to hear about. But I'm sure it's also sparking some creativity, and there's even new things that people are trying coming out of COVID that they may have not been willing to try beforehand. So
very true. Very true.
I'd love to hear more on that design side, Sachel, as a designer that's working inside of the trade show industry, working with so many different stakeholders that aren't designers. We've talked about burnout. What are some of the effects of burnout on designers? And what are the things that can pull them out of a burnout situation? If we've got designers on our team as leaders, how can we understand and empathize with them a little bit more and understand how we can even aid them outside of what we've talked about with the death spiral and taking on the right projects? I'm sure, is there a burnout that comes from even just working too much of the same type of project where you feel like you're not even being creative anymore? You're just going through the process.
Well, and even the business leaders listening. And what are those symptoms to look for, Sachel?
I think some of it is listening. I think that Khalil talks about this idea of, are you running the business or are you in the business? I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it fascinates me. And this idea of, I love
that subject. That's a fantastic.
If you're running the business, part of your job is to be a good listener. And when we post-COVID, as people reimagine their business, we need to be mindful that every one of the employees, not only just the designers, is looking for their next job. And if we can curate that within our own organization, then we're even better. And if you're listening, then you'll know what the next step for the designer is. And one of the challenges is a big project comes in. Let's just say the three of us are designers and Khalil's our big dog designer. Okay. And a big project, high dollar project comes in and we give it to Khalil. So Khalil gets to work on that one. Chris gets existing business and I kind of get the small pop-up stuff. But I want to eventually be a big dog. And I've been working at our organization for a couple years or even a year, and they came from Bemidji State, and that person is thinking about doing a bigger project. And one of the things when a big project that Khalil's working on is the owner of the organization of our design team could come into my office and say, Sachel, we got this big client that came in. I'm going to give Khalil the project, but you have to do all the stuff you're currently working on. But what do you think about also putting forth a design concept? You're going to have to do it on your own time. It's up to you if you want to do it. If you don't do it, I respect that. And I understand that you're busy and have a life outside of this life. And do you want to do it? And oftentimes the younger designer will persevere and show some self-reliance and take on the project, and they might actually win it. And being thought of as somebody that could maybe work on a big project, build my portfolio, things like that, those are all things that are important. And so being mindful of how our organizations distributes projects is an opportunity to deal with some of that burnout. And
is that do you see that? And you interact with enough exhibit houses and the high level executives there. Do we, because when I'm listening to you, and if I've got those three designers you just described, I'm at a place in my life and in my organization, I have responsibility to bring, so yes, Khalil may be in first chair on the big project, but I've got to bring the farm team along. I've got to give opportunities. I'm not going to ask you to do that on your own time. Now, if you're already at capacity, am I going to pay overtime or double time for that? We got to figure that out. But in the end, I want to give them the opportunity because they're never going to be, bench strength doesn't get stronger if leadership is not investing in that next generation of talent, right? Is that a fair statement?
Totally.
And I wonder, do we screw that up? Are you seeing a lot of exhibit houses that don't have a strategic approach to developing the bench?
Yeah, I actually think that one of the mistakes companies are making is potentially twofold. The first is sometimes junior designer feels the only way that they're going to get to become a senior designer or a creative director or get shots at the bigger projects is if they actually switch companies. And that happens. And then the companies, we have a discussion about it and they're like, why do you think they left? And it was like, well, they wanted a shot at the bigger projects. And
you still see them as a production artist, not as a designer, right? I totally, that's a great point.
And they went to school to be a designer on some of these bigger projects. And they may think, the challenge is that they may think that they're ready for a big project a year in or 6 months in. And if you can afford to throw them this project, then that's fine. But sometimes if you can afford it, sometimes just saying, here's the deal. I want you to feel valued. I see you growing in this organization and this project came in. I want you to know that 20% of your time, I want you to work on this project. Even if they don't meet the deadline, let's say the deadline is in 2 weeks, but you want them to do this project and they submit it in a month. And Khalil gets to submit his, and that's the one you actually pitch to the client. But then then I get to pitch it, but I do almost like an internal pitch. And because I want to build my portfolio and I want to get better. I don't just want to continue to design 10 by 10s and table drapes. You know what I mean? And I want to start thinking about things like drayage, and I want to start thinking about things like hanging signs, and but there's only certain level of projects do come in the door that have that kind of budget.
Satchel, you just answered your own question about the difference between working on the business and working in the business. The high level exhibit house owner that's still his own top salesperson who comes to Khalil with every project because Khalil's the top hitter on the design team and he wants it done and he wants to go to the front of the line, and that's a guy that's working in his business, and be damned with how disruptive it might be. The guy you just described that's conscious about, hey, I really want 3 Khalils. So I've got to bring young Sachel along and Griffin along. And so when you sit there and you're literally strategically thinking about assignment, or, yeah, we may pitch this one, but I'm going to show you the respect, and you're still doing a pitch. It just may be internal. My point is, you are working on your business when you are doing things like that. You are developing the pitch. And so I think that's a great example right there of what is the difference. When you're tree top height, right, and you look down, every military group that goes into a war zone, and we do battle in the design world every day, right? You've got to have somebody on Overwatch, somebody that's looking down to say, okay, group's getting thirsty here. We got to bump them this way. Or, hey, there's a cliff. We can't keep running full speed that way. We've got to move. If there's not an owner or a business leader that's working on the business on Overwatch there, everybody's at risk at some point. And I think burnout is the number one, or PTSD. That's the number one thing. And the real cost, like you said, they go looking for work somewhere else, and exactly. That's brutal.
Yep. And the other thing is, not only do we want to challenge and support all of our designers, and that may look different. We still want to, even if Khalil's our big hitter designer, we still want to challenge and support him. And that might look different than it looks for Griffin and what it looks like for Sachel. And so as the person that is running the business, they need to be listening to make sure that they know how to adequately challenge and support each one of their employees. One of the ways that they could support the design team is sometimes they continue to get design projects, and they're the ones that are staying late and putting in the hours, and then they don't always get in on the action. And so even there should potentially be some type of percentage. The salespeople oftentimes get some type of commission for a project, and it would be really interesting when we reimagine our companies post-COVID to get the design team in on the action. And then they will, sometimes we talk about creativity as if, designers, they design things, but they don't understand gravity. Well, if they start getting X percent, if the project sells, they're going to really start to figure gravity out really fast, I feel. And so when they have skin in the game, I think is an interesting way to support and to alleviate some of the symptoms of burnout.
By the way, we call that hitting the buildability button on the computer when you talk about gravity. We know you hit the make look good button, but we just need the buildability button to be hit too.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that here at Bemidji State we're super grateful for. We've gotten a number of donations, and so our process is we teach students the elements of art, principles of design, and they learn how to sketch. And we use sketching as a brainstorming tool, divergent thinking of let's come up with as many ideas as possible, and then let's kind of reevaluate, listen to the customer's needs, and let's hone in and start doing convergent thinking and come up with a few solutions. And then let's model it out in the 3D software. We're using VR goggles where we can test the spaces. But now we can actually build. We have a lot of manufactured systems. We have B-Matrix, we have AluVision, we have some Octanorm, and we have an AGUM kit. But if we can teach our students how things go together and how the connectors work, and we're actually printing on large format printers and we're applying them to Sintra, and then it allows us to have a conversation about drayage, you know what I mean? And say, if we were to build this out of 2x4s and plywood, how much would it weigh? And as opposed to building it out of a panel with a Sintra, a B-Matrix frame with a Sintra panel over it. And so we're really, the educational experience that we're giving our students will help the industry and makes the designers have a deeper appreciation for buildability. We have an entire class called Materials, Lighting, and Structure dedicated to our designers learning about buildability.
I think we've talked about this before. So much of a customer's behind the scenes costs, which are real costs, are based on the weight of the structure, of the design. So traditional wood and 2x4s and plywood and whatever that might be papered over, right? And it might all pack into 5 crates, where pre-engineered aluminum frames might all compartmentalize into 2 crates in 1 skid. And if you go, this one's 15,000 pounds and this one over here is 5,000 pounds. Well, not only does the transportation on the truck is a per pound weight, but then the material handling, once it gets to the dock and it's going to be unloaded, doesn't matter that it's going to be in the same 20 by 20 or 20 foot by 30 foot exhibit space. It's that unloading your truck, it's literally 3 times the cost. So if it's $100 per hundredweight, right? So what you have is 150 times $100, 150 100-pound weights. That 15,000 pounds is going to cost you $15,000 to unload the truck and take your empties away and bring them back at the end of the show, versus 5,000. So my point is, I love that the designers are understanding the consequences, the cost consequences of the materials you're using. Very important.
Yeah. It's really, to go back to this idea of customer burnout, it's really hard to explain to somebody how you can conceptually ship something from Tokyo to Las Vegas, and it's just as much as shipping it from outside the convention center to where it is on the trade show floor. You're like, how? And it doesn't always make sense. I was really hopeful that COVID would allow the industry to reimagine itself and maybe come up with some other metrics of
that's another episode, my friend. We'll have you back. We'll have you back for that round robin.
So one of the questions you asked was, what's something that creatives can do to recharge?
Yes.
And I kind of came up with a short list is, at the core, creatives need to be mindful that they need to participate in self-care and take care of themselves. And it's outside of the job. And sometimes the job requires a lot of sitting and things like that, and can create some unhappiness. Just the physicality of a designer in the lifestyle. You're sitting behind a computer a lot, and just kind of being mindful of like exercising and eating well and taking breaks. And so we as creatives need to be extremely mindful to take care of our bodies, because you are who you are at 59, Chris, because of how you treated yourself at 30. Even if it's your 29th anniversary of your 30th birthday or whatever.
Oh, you do watch.
And it could, another thing is just kind of being mindful and being present. Sometimes we think that the way things are now, like, I have way too many projects going on right now. You think that that's the way it's going to be forever. and we kind of get a little bit overwhelmed about the future. And, if we just kind of live in the present, work on the projects we're working on now, be really mindful about completing the tasks today, and then when 2 weeks from now happen, it's usually not going to be as bad as it was. And, when there's going to be times where you have a really light schedule, and you just kind of need to manage the ebbs and flows and communicate with the leadership. And this is kind of one of the things that a way of recharging is being mindful of your personal growth and figuring out where you've been, where you are, and where you want to go, and make sure that you're communicating that effectively. You shouldn't have to quit your job to get your hands on a big project that Khalil's working on.
Yeah.
You should be able to have a sit down with leadership and say, hey, I love this company. I love the projects I'm working on. But when I think about my personal and professional growth trajectory, I want to be eventually working on some bigger projects. So when my parents ask me what I do, they probably still won't get it, but I can tell them that I had a hand in working on a project for Google at CES or something like that. And they're projects that people know the name of the company, they have big enough budgets, and they're more showy, so to speak. And so just being mindful of your personal growth, professional growth, and being a good communicator about that.
That's Khalil talks to me all the time about, we talk about culture. Is the work meaningful, right?
Yeah.
Is there joy in what they're doing? And as a leader, I'm much more conscious now of all the people in my organization. I mean, I know in a minute we're going to probably get to our wrap up and start talking about takeaways, but to I think that's, if it's a churn and burn chop shop type of a mentality, and I love what you said, we know there's going to be these peaks, but there's also valleys in work. So when you're really grinding, right, and it's 12-hour days, we need our colleagues to say, man, we got about another 3-week run, and we've cleared out the pipeline, and we got some breathing room. So let's not lose it here. But if that shop never changes the pace of play for that design team, this is where you're putting your employees at risk, and your company's at risk of losing people, because nobody's going to put up with that for a permanent
Totally.
environment, right? So I agree with that.
Yeah. The idea of creating a routine. I hate looking at my calendar all the time, and I think most creatives do. They don't. I think of people that are retired and they don't know what day it is. Like, I love that idea. But like, I also find that idea means that I'm not as productive as I probably could be. And creatives that keep routines, I feel will be able to navigate time to recharge, but also time to be really productive. And sometimes there's a little bit of a ramp up, when we think about creativity as an individual, but then creativity as the process of doing the work. Sometimes it's hard to get started on a project. Sometimes it's hard to know when you're done with a project. And sometimes your schedule and your routine can dictate some of this, but you don't just want it to happen serendipitously or whenever the salesperson says, I need it by 2:00. You want to actually start planning, and then you can factor in times for going on a walk or things like that. And so keeping a routine is something that I would strongly suggest to other creatives. It's something that, again, for me, I don't necessarily love doing it, but I find that I'm able to be a good dad. I'm able to be a good professor. I'm also able to be an entrepreneur and able to be a maker too. I really do love making, and I sometimes don't get as much time for it now as I would like. But if I actually keep a routine, I can slot in some time, whether I'm turning wood on a lathe or whatever. And Another one is connecting with nature. We're geographically located in northern Minnesota. It's absolutely beautiful here, but it's beautiful anywhere if you're looking, and open for reflection and looking for inspiration. Another one is engaging in a supportive community. One of the things that working from home is a challenge is how do you connect the people together and create a supportive community. One of the things that I'm hopeful for the event industry is that a lot of companies have a decentralized workforce. And one of the things that they could do is use the trade show or have an event where they actually bring all their employees together. So or their C-level executives or their mid-level management or their creative teams. One of the organizations that I worked for used to do a design camp where the designers would go out and do fun stuff. And it's all about being a part of a community of practice. And whether that community of practice is your design team or the project managers or the organization as a whole, it just is really important that you feel connected to that group. And it's one of the ways that you can feel encouragement, inspired, and motivated. And so I think that's really important. And then always seeking inspiration. This is something that I think is really easy for makers, designers, artists, is we're always sponges. And I feel that if we're not going to galleries, museums, reading books, attending theater performances, or just going to shows, it's amazing how many designers in the event industry don't go to events. And it's kind of sad. And so how can leadership create like a mentality where the design team is actually getting inspired partially while they're getting paid? Does that make sense? It's almost like that's an after hours thing. And it's always going to be an after hours thing, because when designers aren't at work, they're just continuing to soak up inspiration wherever they go. And so it's a lifestyle. And I do think that's one of the wonderful things about the creative lifestyle. And we've talked about this idea of really embracing failure. One of the ways that we can prevent burnout is just be open to failure. You know what I mean? Like at a very young age, I was buying and selling cars, and I bought an Infiniti G20, and I was so excited. I love that car. And I got it out onto the highway, and the transmission was out, and I couldn't get out of second gear. So I'm driving 35 miles an hour on the highway, redlining it. And I'm crying because I just spent my money on this heap of junk that isn't working. And I bought it at an auction, so it's not like I could bring it back to the owner. And I had to accept it, move forward, fix the transmission, take the losses, and try to make money on the next one. And that's just the way it goes. That's how entrepreneurship works. But if you never accept failure and move forward, you're constantly just lying to yourself. You know what I mean? And we need to have some level of truth. And this goes back to being a part of a supportive community. If your company has some level of failure rate that's acceptable, you can celebrate failures. You know what I mean? And you're like, all right, that one failed, we're going to celebrate. And if you've kind of can be a part of a supportive group, it's really nice. And then my last one is just kind of practicing gratitude. You know, this is one of the ways that I kind of try to live my life, is just being a creative is a journey, and you're constantly evolving. And however you can stay inspired and resist burnout and be a part of an organization that helps you and supports you. And there's always things that happen within an organization where you can be grateful for. Sometimes people are always focusing on the negative, and those types of people can be cancers within an organization. and just kind of trying to be grateful and trying to thrive is really, really important in meaningful work. So that's kind of the Sachel's creative recharge.
Great advice.
That's fantastic.
Thought.
Well, Sachel, I think the students at Bemidji State are very, very fortunate to have you as their professor, as their mentor and guide as they begin their careers. And so much of what you've shared has been not only obviously insightful to see what you're doing for the students, but just your understanding of how the whole machine works in the industry is extremely helpful for us as leaders in the business side of it, just to get a different perspective and to understand even just how the decisions that we make as leaders impact very specific employees on the design side is really helpful. One thing I didn't want to leave before I understood this, because it's something that I think about a lot with entry-level employees and a lot of them coming out of college, but it's really just the expectation they have going into their work. And one thing that we did talk about was, the entry-level designer, the junior designer wants to be, progressing in their career. They want to jump to that next step to being that senior designer, or maybe eventually being the creative director. And I think that it's one of the things you mentioned, and having clarity about where you want to go. It's so helpful. What are the expectations that universities are setting for students in terms of salary, in terms of career progression, and even just timeline of role? Because I think as the business leaders, it can be frustrating to see sometimes the entry-level student want to put in 1 year of work and then become the creative director.
Yeah.
Or the compensation is the other part of that, clearly. So one is the title and the prestige job after a year, and the other is compensation right out of the gate.
And I think a lot of this isn't necessarily set by the universities. I do want to preface with that. We understand that a lot of it is even set by social media, and just the content that people are consuming and the peers that they see now, not just in their local community, but their peers around the world. So that it's not just on universities by any means. And I think people should strive for high standards, but I know that Chris and I have both seen people coming out of college for entry-level positions, expecting, salaries that come much later in your career. And there is value also, not necessarily in just taking a bad salary or a lower salary, but also in doing more of the production work, doing the lower level work for years at a time, and maybe even having that expectation that is going to get me more reps so that I can become stronger and get more perspective and have more understanding. So anyways, loaded question. I'd love to hear just from your perspective, what are the expectations that you are setting for the students that are coming out of your program?
So the expectations that I'm setting for my students here at Bemidji State that go into, so we have different roles, like we have graphic design, we have interactive multimedia, we have digital illustration and animation. We have a new program called Event Planning and Project Management that takes students through the detailing process, the estimating process, and eventually the project management process. And I've worked with industry and 2-year schools to kind of create this conversation and narrative for organizations. So we can say, Chris, if you're looking for a project manager, how about you hire a detailer from Bemidji State? They have education in project management. We've set the expectations that they will eventually become a project manager. So much money is made and lost in the project management process that just taking a new graduate and throwing them into the project manager role is probably not the greatest path for success for them or the organization or the client. But how can we start them as a detailer, move them into an estimator, and then move them into a project management role over a series of time? Whenever you move that project manager into an estimator role, then you hire a new Bemidji State student into that detailer role. And then they become an estimator. The estimator becomes a project manager. And so we're working with industry to create academic programs that set some of these expectations.
I'm sorry, but Sachel, I am not aware of any other academic institution you've been on this for a couple of years now, at least you and I have talked about this, where you see the industry's needs. You see where on each side of the designer position, right, is account management and project management and production planning. And so I've already, I totally applaud that you're looking at expanding the curriculum at Bemidji, and placing and say, this is the next step. This is the next place. And by the way, the companies, the owners are listening and watching and rooting, because this is the place we want to go, where people have the full scope of skills. So I love what you're doing.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And then, well, thank you. But the other thing is, I'm always telling our students that when they graduate, yes, they've conquered this mountain of a 4-year degree, but they are at the bottom of another huge mountain. And every time you achieve, there's always another mountain, except for only a few. And I like the students to think of the first 2 years after graduation as an extension of their education, except they're not paying for it, they're getting paid, and they should find a job that aligns with their aspirations for what they're trying to achieve. And the challenge is that Bemidji State has, over the years, the program started the idea of the program started in the early 90s. 10 years after that went into the program, and nobody had heard of Bemidji State when I went through the program. And now Bemidji State is a well-known entity within the Experienced Designers and Producers Association and the event industry. And our students are making a good salary. I think that if you look at the top 10 salaries out of higher ed, you see a lot of engineering degrees, but they're making in the 60s and sometimes $70,000 out of college, some of these highest paying jobs. And our students are being offered this kind of money, and this is a challenge. It's also like I'm grateful that our students are making a good wage out of college. A lot of our students are taking out debt to finance their education. The good part about Bemidji State is it's a state institution, and the tuition is relatively low. I think that for what the students are getting, for what they pay, it's a great investment. With that said, when you are making a larger salary when you graduate, the expectation for the student is that it is not an extension of their education, but rather it's game time and it's time to perform. And so I would if you're making hypothetically $40,000, you're given a lot more latitude with your time potentially to walk around the shop, take a Friday and go to the
mall, the furniture store,
the furniture store, the
place that inspires you. Yeah.
Neocon, whatever, CES, whatever show inspires you, and just seek inspiration on the company's dime. When you start making $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000, it's like, okay,
the rules are more rigid. Yeah.
Yeah. You're being hired to help an organization and be a part of a team, generate income, and provide a income for all those that are participating. And while there's a lot of revenue generated in a design department, we still need to be mindful that there's somebody that needs to answer the phone at the front desk, and there's other people that are maybe non-revenue positions that help the organization stay alive and continue a successful culture. And that's what being a part of a team is. And so, I really think that there are benefits and barriers to every salary that you're given. If you're given 40, you have a harder time paying back your loans. If you're given 60, you can pay back your loans easier. You maybe don't have to have a roommate. There are certain luxuries that you can afford. There's trade-offs for everything.
Can I give you this is a soundbite, a mentor. When I was in my 20s and I was a developing contributor full of confidence, this guy, I was in the financial industry, and he said, Griffin, here's the deal. You're going to spend the first 10 years of your career being grossly underpaid. You're going to spend the last 10 years of your career being grossly overpaid. It's the 20 years in the middle that you're going to end up carving out your lifestyle from and supporting your family with. So that's the yin and yang. Now, those timelines might have changed a little bit, but somehow, Sachel, that's the expectations I think some of those students have to have. And it's really what you're saying, and that is, but actually they have a choice. They might end up with a $40,000 opportunity with more flexible boundaries. They might be given a $60,000 right, but guess what? You are going to have to move and relocate and pay what those rents are in that major market city. And maybe that's good for you, maybe it's not. But the point is, the last 10 years, you get to be Stephen Ross. You get to be Dana Esposito. You get to be Sachel Josefson, right? But you don't get to do that in the first 10 years of your career. And the people, our listeners, I'm sure, are going to know those names, because in the hallowed halls of all those wonderful creative institutions like Bemidji and SCAD and FIT, there are some rock star names. And as we've been reminded today, Sachel Josefson is one of those. So I'm super grateful for you joining us today, Sachel, and taking us through this. It's really great.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm super grateful for the opportunity to help share some of the things I've learned over the years. I have lots of ideas. I'd love to be back. So
Yeah, we'd love to have you back. Thank you for sharing so much.
I'll have the Reds by the time you come back.
There you go. Awesome. Well, this has been great. Thank you both so much. I think this will be a great episode for listeners, and we definitely need to have you back, Sachel. So yeah, we'll hopefully see you on the next one.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. All right. Take care, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to the Experience Builders Podcast. Check out our website in the show notes or visit crewxp.com to learn more.